Client Solutions here at Leading Edge Performance. I sit within our growth team, and my role is to lead on bringing to life our offer for clients and potential clients through our kind of sales, marketing, social media, branding, and also through events like today's Performance Hub that we're at today. So I'll be sharing hosting duties today with Ash Smith, who you'll meet later. He's one of our lead team coaches. So my first hosting duty right now is just to let you know that we are recording this session. So we'll record the whole session, but just with the exception of the breakout rooms. It would be great if you could keep your cameras on, because we always like to see who we're talking to. Appreciate if you're in a place where you're not able to do that or you're traveling, then absolutely fine if you have to have them switched off. That's not a problem. And also, we would like to let you know that we will be having a panel session later. So as we go through the session, we'd really like you to build those questions. You can put them into the chat, and then we'll be able to ask them of our guests later on in the panel. So firstly, it's fantastic to be joined by such a mix of organisations today. So we've seen already in the chat with people who are dropping in. So good morning to you all. There's a mix of familiar faces and names to us, and also some people who are new to Leading Edge Performance, and also, I guess, to the concept of Performance Hub. So yeah, just to pull out a few people that we've got here. I think I've already mentioned Birmingham Royal Ballet. We very much enjoyed our chair ballet session a couple of weeks ago, and we had Paul and the team hosted us for an internal meeting there, which was fantastic. Thank you for that. KI Insurance, Nick and I were visiting your rather swanky offices earlier this week. We had a good conversation about leadership with you. We've got friends from Mars Pet Care, Mars Confectionery, welcome to you. We've got Rico there, Guggenheim Partners, Tetra Pak. So yeah, lots of great variety. So welcome to you all, and we're really excited to see so many of you across such a breadth of industries this morning. So we thought for those of you who are a little less familiar with Leading Edge Performance, we'd give you a short introduction. So for almost 20 years, we've worked with global organisations, leaders and teams focused on achieving sustainable performance gains. We're always keeping true to our purpose that you can see there, which is unleashing human performance to change the game. Now, I won't go into too much detail, but you know, with all purpose statements, all the words are important. But in particular, I just want to point you to a couple. So first of all, unleashing. We are about unleashing. We're not about nurturing. We're not about making steady improvements. We're intentional about using that word unleash. And it's also really implicit that we believe performance is within all human beings, and our focus is always on how we can unlock that performance. In fact, that links to today's topic. How do we unleash the performance of individuals, the giving and receiving of effective feedback conversations? And we also seek to get really clear on the game that you're looking to change. So, you know, if you need to deliver development or a training to a population just because you haven't done it for a while, that's great, but that's not necessarily for us. We really want to know what's the shift that you need to make, and we'll work with you to create that shift. And our work sits across broadly 3 areas, so namely transformational change, high performance teams, and high performance leadership. We recognise as well there's a lot of crossover across those 3 areas. And ultimately, we're looking to create sustainable behaviour change in your organisation. And high performance is really the link throughout all of that. And you'll see from the images are chosen because they represent the backgrounds of us as a team, with our expertise coming from experience in high performance businesses, high performance sport environments, and also from the military. And it's that combination that we think gives us a really unique edge. Now, on to the topic for the day. The conversations leaders avoid and elite coaches don't. For those of you who are new to Performance Hub, these are events that we've been running for a number of years. We do them virtually and we do them in person, for current, for new and for potential clients. We look to address topics that we hear our clients are perhaps finding challenging or are seeking help with. And we look to bring our unique insights to those topics, drawing on the lessons that we can learn from high performance environments, whether sporting or otherwise. The interesting thing about today's topic is that almost regardless of the work that we're doing with clients, whether we are unlocking high performance teams or leadership or change, the topic of effective performance conversations comes up time and time again. And given the number of people here today on the call, it's clearly something that resonates with you too. So I'd like to say, first of all, a big thank you to our guest speakers today for joining us to share their insights. So firstly, we have Yola Brooking, People and Culture Director, GB&I for Suntory Beverage and Food. You'll see her, if you can see her on the screen, she's pitch side, looking very fabulous. So she leads the GB&I people agenda across organisational design, culture, leadership, engagement and capability. She supports leaders to build teams that perform, grow and thrive. Yola has over 20 years HR experience spanning business partnering, HR operations and enterprise transformation, mainly roles across Europe, and combines a commercial focus with a strong commitment to employee experience and well-being. We've been working with Yola and her colleagues for about 18 months now, and I'm looking forward to hearing her share her experiences of how they recognised the needs to be more effective in their feedback conversations and how she's then gone on to tackle that. And as we head into the summer, we've got a fantastic series of sports competitions ahead of us. So we know we've got the World Cup coming up in a few days, and that'll be followed closely by by Wimbledon. And so we're really delighted that Ian Bates, fresh from the French Open, has agreed to join us to share his experiences and insights. Ian's been in his role as head of women's tennis at the LTA since 2018, through a period where British women's tennis has had really great success on the global stage, including Emma Raducanu winning the US Open in 2021, the GB team being ranked number 2 in the world on the Billie Jean Cup world rankings, multiple WTA tour singles and doubles titles, and 6 players breaking the WTA top 100 in singles. So I think some fantastic progress and performance there in that in the women's tennis arena. Ian also led the Team GB tennis team at the 2016, 2021 and 2024 Olympics. That included Andy Murray, if you remember, becoming the first man to defend an Olympic gold medal in Rio. He's been coached to the British Billie Jean King Cup since 2012. Ian's a former pro player and is a graduate of the University of Bath. And finally, we welcome our very own Nick Levitt, so lead team coach here at Leading Edge Performance, who's worked across the world of high performance for 25 years, with experience leading talent identification for the FA, for the Men's England Football Pathway, through to multiple Olympic sports, as well as spending time in environments such as Google, the Red Arrows, Linklaters, Red Bull, and Les Mis. I still want to know the deal with Les Mis. Are you on the stage? I'm not sure. So welcome and thank you to you for giving your time today. So more from our guests later. For now, I'd like to introduce you to Tom Foley, who's our lead human intelligence performance specialist. He's going to set the scene for us today by sharing some of the research that we've recently done into what makes an effective performance conversation. So Tom, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and great to see so many of you joining us this morning. I'm Tom Foley. I'm the lead human intelligence specialist for performance at Leading Edge Performance, and I lead the team of HIPs, as they're known, in trying to uncover the latent human insight within organisations. So I thought it'd be really good just to give you a little bit of an introduction into what human intelligence for performance really is. And we talk about it being the third lens that turns data and noise into data and insight. So when you look at any organization, they tend to be really good at dealing with the technical and the tactical elements of the day-to-day. So the technical is basically anything data related, anything that you can measure. And I'm sure that everybody on this call is drowning in data and numbers and spreadsheets. The tactical element is all around your strategy, what the market is doing, what your business plan might be. And those two things are really, really important. But what we find is that the actual competitive edge is the human element. And that's the bit that reveals how the humans in the system really work, and how we can turn that into decisions, influence and outcomes which improve the organization's performance. The tension around this is that the technical and tactical are clearly really important, and fundamentally they only form part of the decision-making process. Now that we're in a situation, especially with global markets as they are, that margins are continuously being squeezed, and especially with AI taking a lot of that margin out of decision making, what we find is that outcomes are increasingly hinge on the unmeasured. So we call it the metric black hole. They center on trust, influence, decision behaviors under pressure, perceptions of the people who are actually delivering the work. organizations can often tell you exactly what's happening from a data point of view, but if you ask them what's actually happening in terms of how people see the organization, they will not be able to give you those answers. And the performance of that organization is normally shaped by the hidden alignment or misalignment and dissonance inside the system. So this is the third lens that we try to uncover. One of the tools that we use to do this is through decompression interviews. These are one-to-one interviews, which we've done in readiness for today as well, where we try and reveal the human factors that underpin performance. When you then combine those with the technical and the tactical, that gives you the full picture of the current reality, the where are we now? And the quote at the top there, a sat nav is useless unless you know where you're starting from. You can have the best roadmap, you can have the best idea of where you want to get to, but unless you know where you're starting from, unless you know the current reality, that sat nav, that journey is irrelevant. There are other things that we do just to talk about very quickly in terms of decompression interviews are the one-to-one interviews that I talked about now. Other ways of dealing with this latent human intelligence that we use, performance profiling, where we try and profile and extract the DNA of top performers within an organization to understand their mindset, their skill set, so that we can codify it into a profile that becomes a benchmark for that organization. We also use a tool called human terrain analysis, where we try and map how the system works in terms of its people interactions, not the organization chart, not the hierarchical organogram. We want to identify where the key change agents are, where the blockers are, where the bottlenecks, and where we can really influence in order to improve performance. We also talk about a narrative arc, which is a highly contextualized, specific 360 profile that reveals the strengths, the leadership shadow, how your leadership is really experienced by people. That then fuels coaching and behavior change. And linked to that as well is high performance negotiation and influence, where we combine commercial negotiation skills, human intelligence, and the neuroscience behind it to develop high performance negotiation skills, helping people to improve their influence, achieve better outcomes, and deliver tangible advantage. Wait for the slide to move. So what we did in this situation then is we interviewed a number of people who have either worked in elite sport or as coaches or have been coached in the elite sporting world. And we tried to understand what a performance conversation was. We tried to get under the skin of what needs to be true for a performance conversation to have maximum impact. We also tried to look at when it's not done quite so well. And try and learn from those things so that we can ensure that when we develop our skills in performance conversations, that we're doing it to have the maximum impact. And then we looked at how that sporting analogy translates into the business world. What does sport do really well that perhaps business is lagging behind on? And that came out of a conversation that I had with a senior leader in a large multinational recently, where they said performance conversations are the single biggest area that they see leaders struggle with the most. And based on the chat at the start of this call, I think that's probably been reflected there pretty well as well. So the first question that we asked was, okay, well, what is a performance conversation? And there was a huge amount of alignment in this, based from both the athletes and the coaches. And what it converged on was it having real intent in order to change behavior. The other thing that it was that it was an intentional act. It was something that you had to work at, and it was a conversation, not a one-way download from coach to player, coach to performer. Honesty and trust were a huge part of it, but it was also the fact that we needed to get to the point of the conversation. And there was also the issue that this is a highly contextual thing, and the context of the conversation will deal with so many different things, but it's on a spectrum from positive to corrective. A nice definition there, it's an intentional two-way conversation aimed at acknowledging or changing behavior, whether it's formal or informal, with the performer and often the people around them. The quote at the bottom, it's almost entirely contextual, anything where the outcome is acknowledgement or change of behavior. Not always with the performer or the athlete, but often with the people around them as well. So if it was a pathway athlete, it was around talking to their parents, support staff, club coaches. In the business context, it might be the people that you lead, especially, and then the people who are leading you. So we asked people, what do you think needs to be true for impact? How do we create the conditions for positive change? The key thing here was trust that came about. The relationship is a precondition. It doesn't need to be close. It doesn't need to be a friendly one, but it needs to be a two-way professional relationship with care. And we'll talk about care a little bit more in a second. The quote at the top there, there's kindness in clarity and a willingness to be wrong. We need to know the person and the context, why they make decision, what influences them, what's true in their world at this point in time. If you go in informed, you're less likely to be blindsided and you're likely to have more impact. We talk about care and not niceness. Niceness skirts the truth and tells people what they want to hear to keep that room and that relationship comfortable. We can develop you so much, but this is the path that would be more helpful to you, was one of the quotes that came out. The technique that was used by most people was all around, actually, it's a two-way conversation and the person has to self-reflect. We talk about curiosity before judgment. So asking the questions before giving your opinion, opening with a question, not a verdict. Can we talk about that meeting was one that was used in business context quite a lot. There also needed to be an element of vulnerability from both parties. So both from the performer or the athlete to be willing to accept criticism and challenge, but also from the coach to admit when they were wrong, own it when something doesn't land, revisit the ceilings that you've based on people, asking the athlete, are you getting what you need from me? And then the self-regulation by the coach is a key thing. The coach's own state management is the lever. State precedes traits. So if you're turning up, coach, in the red state, then clearly that's not going to have the best impact on some people. So being able to regulate your behavior and focusing back on the athlete or performer is a key part of this. We also asked, when have you seen it done badly? And the key point here was all around consistency. The number one failure mode, if you like, was not knowing which version of the person is going to walk in. People going into that threat state before the conversation has even started, worrying about what sort of person is going to turn up. What mood is my coach going to be in today? Blindsiding. This was picked up by 60% of the interviews that we did as well. So people should know what's coming deep down. If they're truly honest, they should know what's coming. If we're going in with something that isn't expected, that will hijack and that will automatically put people into that threat state, and they will close down and be less likely to listen. On the flip side, there's this false harmony, this idea of fear of conflict, skirting the issue, over-coaching, using metaphors as a way to soften the actual point. People are looking to maintain a false harmony. Tensions then sit low in the organization and they bubble up, and all of a sudden it fills the vacuum that's created by not having those critical and challenging conversations. And then the last point was around the coach coming in and being the oracle and being that person who just turns up and tells you how it should be done. One of the quotes was, I never used to do it that way. So actually not framing it in the status of the coach, but framing it in the status of the athlete and putting it back on them. You've not even taken the time to find out who I am and what I think. So I think the important thing now is to actually think about, well, actually, how does this translate into the corporate world? Lovely quote here from somebody where they said that the business people don't pass the ball to each other. Their ball is the conversations, and there's a lack of intentionality around the skill of having a good one. So what sport does right, which we think business doesn't do quite so well, so that in sport, those performance conversations, they happen constantly. They happen after every training session. They happen after every gym session. They happen after every match. The feedback is there immediately. You've got instant access to information. Constant low-stake reps build the high-stake skill. Players are the work. I think this is a really good point that was made by somebody yesterday, where they talk about, in sport, your players on the field are the ones that are going out enabling you to achieve. Is that really how we see it in the business world? Is that the context that we see it in the business world? That was a little bit of an eye-opener to me. In sport, coaches are very good at pointing out your super strengths, highlighting what you do really well. Outside of sport, there's a feeling and a perception amongst the people that we spoke to that that's not done quite so well. And I think the other thing is that in sport, people take accountability for their own performance a lot more. Businesses don't do this often enough. In business, we wait for others to tell us rather than noticing ourselves. So where the business breaks down a little bit at the moment, we talk a good game. And I think the chat at the start of this, where I think the majority of people were hiding under the towel at the side of the tennis court. Companies say they want to have performance conversations. The reality, we're scared of them and we talk a good game and we run from them. The other problem we have in business is we don't go through the cycle of train, reflect, adapt. We're always match day. We are always having to perform. And in sport, we review after every training session, let alone every game. In business, we just don't, because we're on to the next thing. It's always match day. In business, we're perhaps a little bit more outcome driven. So if the numbers, the technical and the tactical data at the end of the month are good, we don't tend to worry too much about the development. If we actually thought about how people grow and people invest, if we invested time and trust in that, there's no doubt that they would perform better. And then linked to the first bit there, metaphors and false harmony. Businesses often look for excuses to delay the performance conversations. There's a fear of conflict, there's a false harmony, tensions then explode when it's too late. We need to move to a sooner point of action. And overall, that shift came across as a reframe in performance conversation as coaching, rather than labeling it as a critique and making it into the daily muscle. So very conscious of time, so I'm just going to go on very quickly to some highlights, if you like, some summaries of what the conversations leaders avoid are. Elite coaches don't avoid the hard conversation. They make it part of the daily muscle, not the diary event. So we need to invest in that relationship first. We need to speak to that person and understand their context. As leaders and coaches, we need to show up consistently. People need to know what they're going to get. And we use this curiosity before judgment. I'm going to now hand you over to Ash, who's going to talk through some of these things, I think, with Yola.
Sorry, I just moved up too quickly then, but hello.
Cool, thank you, Tom. Yeah, absolutely. It's great to sort of listen through that data and then think about some of the things that might come out in my conversation with Yola in a moment. So Yola, firstly, thank you for joining us. I'm not going to do much of an intro to me, as Lindsay introduced me earlier on. So for those I haven't met, Ash Smith, lead team coach, and I have been supporting Yola and Suntory GB in Ireland on their journey, as Lindsay said, for the last 18 months. Yola, a lot of water has passed under the bridge in that 18 months, and we've done loads of work with you and loads of interventions with you. Can we just roll back to sort of, was it November 2024? I think we first got involved. What was the trigger that made you kind of go, we need a little bit of support in our business and leading edge of the people? What was that trigger moment?
Yeah, for sure. So 2024 was a really difficult year for us at Suntory. We had our first strike in 50 years. So our employees in our factory decided to go on strike. We sadly had a death in our factory. So one of our employees passed away, which was pretty horrendous and tragic at the time. And we also had a lot of change programs going on. Our business performance had gone backwards. We had gone from being the top 3 soft drinks to number 4, number 5, number 6. We had kind of fallen off our podium, and things were in a pretty bad way. And as a lead team, we were like, something needs to change here. So we got in touch with Leading Edge Performance. I remember very much that first meeting. And we thought, right, these are the guys that are going to hopefully be able to help us through this. And so much has changed since then. It's been very cathartic to look back at where we were and where we are today. So yeah, we definitely hid under the towel a lot when it came to performance conversations back then.
Thank you. And yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things we did, and Tom has talked it through, was a full sort of company-wide culture decompression to really kind of help the business understand what are the thoughts, feelings, beliefs amongst the population, right from the sort of the executive level at the top, right the way through down. And I think we got right to the sort of the factory floor. So we took a real cross section of the business to really try and understand what was going on culturally, why some of these things were happening. Sort of thinking back to when you heard the decompression, like what were the things that stood out to you? What were the standouts? What surprised you? What did you expect?
I think the main standout was this nice versus kind paradox that we focused on. And I think for me, I was really proud of the fact that we'd built a business that had a really nice culture, like a good culture. People join our business and they're like, it's so great here, you know, people really care about each other. And that was really important to me. But through the decompression, what came out was actually we weren't being that kind. We were being nice, but we weren't actually having the performance conversations to help people grow. And that reframing, I remember exactly the moment, I think Dan said it, the reframing of the conversation from you're nice, but you're not actually being kind enough to help people develop and grow. And I thought, yeah, that's it. That's the light bulb for me. It really made a huge difference in my mindset about where we needed to go.
Yeah, there were some great quotes, weren't there? There was one quote which was, "It's the only place I've ever joined to work where I got whiplash walking through the door because it was so friendly." And they were sort of, the person was taken aback by this wave of friendliness that hit them when they joined. And I think the other one that sticks out to me was, "We beat each other with the bag of carrots." So the carrot and the stick. So we don't use the stick. We beat each other with the bag of carrots instead because we're so nice and so friendly. And it definitely came out, as you say, as a paradox. And it also showed up in this idea of protecting harmony versus performance instead of shifting into a space of harmonized performance. And I think that was definitely something that stood out to us. So sort of thinking back to that period, and as you say, things have changed. What impact did it have at the time on those on your leadership groups avoiding, delaying, or not having those effective performance conversations?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was when we eventually did have to have the performance conversations because things got so bad. It made it so much harder. It was often led by HR. Some of my team would have to go in. It was really tough. People didn't understand the feedback. They didn't know where it was coming from. It often ended in huge, disputes, lots of grievances being raised against leaders, all sorts of issues going on, which could have been nipped in the bud pretty early on if the performance conversations and the coaching was happening at the point that the issues were arising in the beginning. We also lost a lot of really key talent because lots of people felt like they were doing the majority of the work and covering up for other people who weren't doing so much of the work, but they were still not getting the feedback. So they were being allowed to, have a mediocrity of performance in our business. And kind of it was good enough was kind of acceptable. So people were just like, oh, well, I'll just float along and not really worry about it too much. So yeah, it was, looking back, it was a pretty sad place to be, and we did lose some really key talent, which I think is a huge shame for our business, really, ultimately.
Yeah, and I think when we look back, it sort of has knock-on effects, doesn't it? Because some of the other themes that came out through the decompression, you've talked about them there, around sort of accountability, prioritization, and workload decision making. But actually, a lot of those things are downstream of not having the conversations we could have had, should have had sooner, and at the point we needed to have them. So there's sort of a lot of downstream effects from not having those moments.
Yeah, for sure.
Fab. Yola, thank you so much just for sharing a little bit of the story. You're going to join us again later on in a bit of a panel Q&A as well. So as Lindsay queued up at the beginning, if you have got questions for Yola, and obviously we'll speak to Nick and Ian in a little bit as well, please queue them up and we'll pick those up in the chat later on. But Yola, thanks for setting the scene for us and demonstrating some of the challenges. And when we come back to you later on, hopefully we'll find out what's changed and what's different and the direction we're going next.
Yeah,
thanks so much.
Ash.
Linz, I think it's time to get people to share some thoughts from their own worlds.
It most certainly is. So let me just do a quick reshare. So we're going to move into breakouts. Hopefully that was kind of a good discussion. You were able to sort of share some of your context and some of the things that have resonated with you so far. So hopefully you've nominated somebody from your group to add into the chat some of the key points from your sessions. So I'll give you a minute to do that and we'll pick some out. So hopefully I've got the chat up. Yes, I do. So anybody willing to share, or you don't have to post in the chat, you can speak up. Susie, how do we integrate continued reflection to make natural conversations around reviewing performance? Yeah, I like that. Do you want to say a little bit more around that, Susie?
Sorry, I think I actually posted that before I'd finished. What I was
right.
going to do a second one. No, I think we were really we were thinking about different contexts where you would consciously feed in naturally those kind of review points into what you're doing, but in other contexts it tends to be a bit more performance review type, and it's that recognition of making those conversations natural without making them feel like a performance review, but continually reflecting and making that constructive without feeling like you're over managing or over leading or interfering too much with what someone was doing. So we shared some thought. Ollie was sharing some thoughts about those informal conversations when you can catch people, for example, in a lunch queue or something like that, and you can extend those conversations there. And then we sort of raised the question of sometimes you're working remotely. So how is that then built into what we're doing? So I don't know if anyone would have thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, that's always quite hard, isn't it? Especially, most of us are now working remotely at some points, aren't we? So you don't have those water cooler moments to be able to have those conversations anymore, do you? Thank you for that, Susie. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of others. So Nick, your summary, recognising the consequences of having the conversation, and the impact on someone's day, and the emotions afterwards. Care is vital, not enough to care. It's not enough to care, people need to know that you care. I like that. Do you want to say any more around that, Nick?
Not specifically, but the question that you referenced just before that, I'll pick up in the next bit as well, if you like, around that kind of continued reflection. So I kind of pick that up in there. But yeah,
marvellous, thank you. We've got Dan dropped in there. Yeah, nice, be kind, resonated strongly. Yeah, absolutely. High levels of trust needed within teams to enable this to take place. I want for constructive feedback rather than just nice conversations. Yeah, I think that's definitely a theme we see. Tom talks about cultural infrastructure lagging behind the technical in many organisations. How do we create time to have intentional feedback regularly? How do we move from nice to high performance? Sue, in sport, training reflecting and adapting happens quicker than in business. Absolutely. Do you want to say any more around that, Sue?
It kind of goes into the next bullet point, which is like businesses are outcome focused all the time. It's always match day. Like you complete something, you move to the next thing, and there's not that intentional time of reflecting, putting in place any changes, and then moving on and adapting. So yeah.
Always feel like you're switched on in business, and always feel like you're having to go to the next thing, do the next thing without necessarily having that time to pause and reflect. Do you want to give us a bit of a summary of yours? Oh, can't hear you, You don't look on mute. No, okay, thank you, but we'll move to somebody else for the purpose of time. Sorry, who should we go to? Patrick, great conversation with insights on Man United, visually impaired international cricket, HR and LD. Do you want to give us a quick summary of what you discussed in your breakout?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it was just so lovely to have such a great mix. Apologies to Ollie, we were just coming to him on the 10-second warning to get some insights from his really unique perspective around being a visually impaired cricketer and hex teacher and working with guide dogs. But there was some real similarities around. There's definitely this thing about the pace that sport forces you to give feedback in. So if it's implicit you're trying to win this game together, so that helps. And actually, if I'm playing the game with you, Lindy, and I need you to do something different, and if we don't do it now, we won't win. It takes away all of the fear of upsetting you or the over contexting or all of those things. So there's some permission in there somehow. And then when you compare that to traditional business annual cycle of review, it just makes absolutely no sense. So Rebecca was wrestling with that. How do you move those cycles closer? Very interesting.
Fabulous, thank you for that. We'll take one more and then we'll head into the next section. So who can I see there? Mark, do you want to share a little about what you discussed in your breakout?
Discussed a lot of the parameters between business and sport and the perception that all sports are professional, was my take. So in terms of getting the hot feedback or so on when you're dealing with a professional / amateur sport in a learning environment, which is outdoors, freezing cold in the middle of Scotland, you possibly don't get that hot feedback as people are perceiving all the time compared to a professional sport environment, and there could be a bit of a bias on that. There was the classic, the leadership sort of progression beyond their skill set, when we just need to leave that person within that space that they're really, really good at and remunerate properly, and performance pay against that. And then just in sport, you instantly know if you've had a good training session or not compared to a business setting.
Great.
So,
thank you for sharing.
No worries.
Thank you. Fabulous. Right. So we want to, we will move on now. So we're going to introduce you to Ian Bates and to Nick Levitt, who I introduced them obviously at the beginning of the session. So Ash is going to now, I'll hand over to Ash and he will start the conversation with Ian and Nick, and we'll get to hear from their perspective, from an elite performance perspective. So Ash, over to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thank you, chaps, for joining us, Ian and Nick. We've talked with Yola before about sort of a business-wide sort of cultural perspective, and what we thought might be quite helpful for the next sort of 15 minutes or so is to get more into the skill and the will. So how do we help leaders in businesses get more into the doing of these things? How do we do these things well, and what's the experience? Before we do that, though, obviously Lindsay gave you both a glowing introduction at the beginning, so we won't cover that ground again. But what would be interesting to know, I think, is through the course of your careers, especially in sporting careers, what are the types of performance conversations you've had? What are the situations and contexts in which you're doing this kind of stuff on the daily? So, Ian, let's start with you. Where do these things show up in your world?
Well, morning, Ash, and morning, everybody. Well, look, I think listening to the discussion and dialogue so far, people are pretty much bang on with how conversations arise in sport. You know, I think you've got, I guess, the two big areas, one which is in the middle of action, and everybody's right, those things show up and you've got no choice but to deal with them. And whether that's high performance, underperformance, matches being lost, matches being won, sometimes you've got no option but to intervene, and I think that's been encapsulated really nicely. The second part of it, of course, is sport is also like every other business, where you have to sit down with a player or an athlete and you have to give them decisions, or you have to give them feedback either around their overall progression, or whether or not you are going to be selecting them for a team, or if you are going to be renewing an agreement, or you are giving them a chance in a tournament. We're in the middle of our grass season, as the introduction said, and every week we go through conversations with players around wildcard opportunities for the next week. And all the time you're having to give a reason, and a reason why, and a reason why not. And all those things kind of become a micro performance conversation where it feels, if I'm allowed to exhale deeply, I'm in the middle of a performance conversation almost hourly right now. And that's the nature of sport, I guess.
Thanks, Nick. How is it for you in your career, especially through your work at the FA and in the various Olympic programs you've been involved in? And
yeah, not too dissimilar to Ian, and I think it's then just kind of recognizing that it will go on almost constantly, and the formal and informal bit that Tom referenced earlier in some of the feedback, the informal happens almost more frequently and regularly if you're with the players on a daily basis, because it becomes the muscle of conversation in a different way. And whether that looks like a well done as a bit of feedback, or it is some coaching feedback, or it is a bit of a summative assessment of this is where we think you're at feedback. Yeah. It happens a lot. And then some of the nature of the roles I ended up in is you're also then feeding back to coaches that are then working with the athletes. So you kind of ended up, it's not just I'm having a conversation with a player, it's then having a conversation with a coach about some of their actions in some of those kind of head of coaching type roles I had at Premier League clubs. So you end up finding kind of lots of different levels to it. The biggest challenge I often found was linked to you having a performance conversation where someone is either in or out of a system. And often, certainly in those kind of younger formative years of athletes, the biggest challenge was often less the athlete or player and sometimes the parents. And I've certainly experienced parents sat on the floor wailing in tears as their little son has been released from a pathway, and the son was absolutely fine because they knew that they were really struggling. It was the parents that was often the challenge. So yeah, there's different levels that this kind of plays out at.
Thanks, both. So let's get into the skill and the will of it in a little bit more detail. So Ian, Tom talked earlier on about the importance of the coach sort of, or the person holding the performance conversation, showing some vulnerability, having good self-regulation, showing up consistently. When you know, and you said, you know, you're in these conversations regularly at the moment, when you know you've got to have them and you've got to deliver the message in the right way, how do you get into a space where you feel confident in your delivery, the intentionality behind it, and making sure you get sort of how you want the other person to feel? How do you set yourself up for success before the other person?
Anything else you want to add into that question, or is that
no, that's plenty for now.
Wow. I mean, I think the first thing is that no performance conversation is the same. I think somebody said already around the being context specific. Every performance conversation, I think, is person and context specific. And some of those you can prepare for, and some of them you can't prepare for. So, for example, let's take the situation now. If I'm having a conversation about having a decision on a wild card with the player, for example, I know I've got to have that conversation so I can prepare for it. If it's that in match moment or it's a coaching situation, I can't prepare for it. So you've always got to have that adaptability and skill. And I think that's where the authenticity comes in, is that you want to be striving to be the same character, whether you're planned and you can prepare everything, or you're just having to react to a player cornering you in the lunch queue or whatever else it may be. You don't always get the benefit of time. But if we're saying this, the question is around having time, you know, it's around then the conditions you create in that situation, right? So you want to know the individual. So there very much is that person first approach. I'm a big believer in a person first approach to my coaching, and that has to go the same too when you're having conversations with people. There was a bit someone said earlier around minimizing the them v me. So how do you create that kind of environment where there are no surprises in the conversation? Somebody knows they're coming to talk to you about this, and therefore you can frame the conversation in that way. And if you then have that conversation in the right place and at the right time, then you've got a much better chance of being successful. You know, again, over the course of my career, I would have had times where I remember one really clearly at the 2012 Olympics. I was just told to go and tell a player a decision. I wasn't the leader. I was just being given the message to go and tell them. And I did it at the side of the court at the end of a practice. And you can imagine how that went, right? But it's all the time just thinking back and reflecting then on those things versus having, you know, when you're going to deliver that message, what is it that you actually need to do that successful? And right place, right time, I think is really important. I think there was a bit in the question around how you feel confident in your delivery and how you kind of are preparing yourself for that. And there's no substitute for preparation. You know, I did talk about not always having the luxury of it, but when you do, prepare really clearly and have clarity of the message you want to give. You know, if you can link that to a selection policy or a strategy or something like that, then it's much easier. I'm not selecting you because of this, which links to that. And actually you then support that with evidence. If you can get that kind of cycle well, I think it makes the conversations much easier, which is, again, is also where the authenticity comes into it. And, you know, I think the final thing I'd say, Ash, is probably a bit around, you need to give the athlete the floor to ask you questions, which again, I also think you can prepare for. So you can prepare for what kind of question might you get asked. So what do I need to do to be selected next time? You've got to be ready with that answer. It could just be there's an emotional reaction from what you've said or done. But I think kind of in all those ways, that's how I would go into a conversation. So conditions set, kind of be clear with my message and kind of almost know that I'm likely to get a question in response.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ian. And Nick, you spent a large chunk of your career sort of not only developing young talented players, but also developing coaches in one of your roles. How, when we're sort of thinking about the will of having performance conversations, and again, I think that was reflective at the start with lots of people choosing their head under the towel as a sort of a metaphor for avoiding them. How do you help people get past that sort of natural human aversion to making others uncomfortable? You know, we've talked a lot in that nice versus kind space. How do you, in your coach development hat on, how do you help people get past that?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of reframing that kind of needs to go on in there. And I think kind of most leaders think that's that I need to be brave enough to do it instead of what does the other person need from me? So kind of reframing it to actually the support that you're offering in that space is a really important bit, because I think the best leaders don't have difficult conversations because they're courageous. They have them because they're being responsible. And that's often the role that comes with them in that kind of space. And it's that kind of the reframe of discomfort, I think, really is like most leaders kind of avoid the conversation because they don't want 5 minutes of discomfort. But avoidance then creates, weeks of frustration, team resentment, lower standards, damaged trust, all of those kind of bits. So really, you're not choosing between discomfort and no discomfort. You're kind of choosing who experiences the discomfort and when. So it's that kind of reframing bit there. And I think from kind of the coaching sports world, like no elite coach would watch a player repeatedly make the same mistake and stay silent. Like we'd probably call that neglect, not kindness. And that's the kind of that link to leadership for me. Is the same is true in organizations. Like protecting people from feedback often protects them from growth. And I think it's making sure that what we're doing is recognizing that that's the key part. And so that most leaders, again, they know the conversation they need to have, but it then comes back to the identity. It's like kind of what kind of leader do I want to be when standards are slipping? And that's often the kind of the reframe bit for me is, and if I genuinely care about your success as a coach or as a player, like I owe you that truth. And then the challenge is delivering it with trust and positive intent and being there to help rather than judge, and all of those kind of pieces that ultimately you step into the delivery part of it, but it's the reframing of it that's the crucial bit.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. And Ian, we've talked a lot sort of, and especially in the business world, it's often hard to, either some hard truths get sugar coated, or sort of people are conscious of egos and relationships and trying to hold those relationships. You've obviously had to deliver some pretty harsh messages to players around selection, funding, etc. How do you deliver that message with real clarity, but also helping keep the individual kind of feel psychologically safe and stay motivated?
Well, I mean, look, I don't think it's easy. I don't think whatever the context you're working in, nobody looks forward to those conversations. But again, I think somebody said earlier, sport demands a stop point. So therefore, you actually have to have that conversation at that point. But I would also hope that a hard truth is never a complete surprise. And I think that's where a number of the points that people have made so far around the lunch conversations or walking off the pitch conversations or whatever, where I think you're constantly setting the scene for a decision that might be coming. I'm having constant conversations already with people around Wimbledon, right? It's a big grass court event. Everybody knows it. In a couple of weeks' time, everyone's got expectations off the charts. There's going to come an afternoon where I have to call everybody and give them a decision. Whereas the more I'm setting the scene now on what I think might be happening, the easier that hard truth gets to, where I've got to give the message with absolute clarity. But I do think on a general level, I think that this is where good individual development plans really kick in for longer development of a player or of a staff member or whatever, that if you have objectives and you are reviewing those objectives throughout the course of the year, they should know by the time they get to the point of review how they're getting on. Like, again, somebody said people know if they've had a good match or they've performed well or they've had a good training session. But ultimately, if somebody has a long-term development plan and that's been reviewed at Q1, Q2, Q3 and decision point at Q4, nobody should come into a meeting room not with any expectation of what the message is going to be. So that's how I think you really draw on those things. And I think you're creating, the awareness with the player, which ultimately creates the safety for them, knowing what the expectations from you of them are, regularly tracking how they are doing against that, giving feedback consistently through the course of the year. This is your progress against this objective. This is your match data from the last 6 games. This is what it's showing you. So when it comes to the hard truth moment, okay, unless it's behavioural or it's misconduct, it should never be an absolute surprise. And I think if you can keep working towards that, I think it makes that really hard truth moment, bloody difficult phone call, really hard face-to-face meeting, just that a little bit easier.
Brilliant, thanks both. Before we move into a bit of what are your top sort of 2 or 3 tips to share with everybody before we invite Yola back in? Something's just sprung to mind as you've been talking and reading through the chat. I think, and Nick, it goes back to your point about reframing. I think a lot of the time when we start thinking about performance conversations, we sort of think about them in the negative context. Can either of you or both of you just give us an example of where one of these performance conversations has been framed in the really positive, maybe it's a positive review of an event or a moment, and that's also led to a positive change in behavior? Putting you on the spot, because that wasn't on the question plan I shared with you, but it just popped into my brain.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the nature of elite sports coaching, is the worst coaches I see are deficit detectors, right? Like all they do is focus on the stuff that's not good and not going well. You need to improve this. You need to do this differently. I think if we kind of go with that notion of almost like a 5-to-1 positive type ratio of highlighting the good stuff, and I probably equate it a little bit like parenting. You know, when I say to my 12-year-old son, thanks for putting away everything from the dishwasher this morning, that was really helpful. He then equates that to, oh, I quite like that bit of praise. I'll do that again because it's reaffirmed the behavior. Now, he doesn't realize that I've deliberately left it there to see if he will do it. But that's the nature of coaching, right? Isn't it? Is that you're manufacturing and playing with the environment in order to create different behavioral outcomes. From a skill acquisition perspective, you do the same in sport as you would do in different kind of contexts. So I think some of that kind of simple reaffirming of behavior can focus specifically on the things that you want to reinforce and see more of.
And Ash, if I could just add to that, I mean, I think it's much easier to sometimes give feedback after a win. We don't always remember that. You know, if you had a really good achievement or a good moment or whatever, then actually you can reinforce that and then add some other bits of colour. So again, an example last week is a match was won in Paris by one of the players, but there were some question marks over something they were doing. So you can go really hard on, great, the match was won, blah, blah, blah. But next time we need to see this, right? So you can sometimes catch a person being good and then add your colour after that, rather than just when something good has happened, let it be. I think that's always a good thing to hold in mind, certainly from a coaching standpoint, is catch people being good as well as people not always achieving what you want them to.
Ash, one of the things, if I link it then into our world at Leading Edge Performance, is we'll often see clients that will only do some reflection when something's gone badly. And actually, one of the lessons that I kind of draw from elite sport is you reflect whether it's gone well or badly, you know, so you take the lessons out of it regardless, and it's how you're developing the muscle of that on an ongoing basis. And one of the conversations I had with a client very recently is like a real practical thing of like, we're now stopping meetings at 5 to the hour, and then the last 5 minutes are a reflection on how the meeting went. Not on what happened or the actions, but how did it go? What went well? Even better if. So we can just start to get that into the regular cadence and muscle of let's review how things go, because we get those moments in sport constantly, daily, little ongoing moments. And that latent slide that might happen in the corporate space that you often get further down the line, you don't see. So how you build it into that regular muscle is an important part as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, both. So in a moment, we're going to invite Yola back in and then open up to some questions from the floor. Very quickly before we do, one top tip for the audience that have joined us today. What is your one top tip each for doing these things really well?
Know the person and be authentic.
Fab. Thanks, Ian. Nick?
Yeah. Curiosity before judgment. Understand their perspective, what's going on first, before you leap in two-footed with your judgment, because it could be wrong.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Really appreciate your insights. We will invite Yola back in as well. And yeah, like I think Lindsay queued it up earlier on. Questions in the chat, and we'll pick some of those out. Lindsay, over to you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, thanks, Ian, Nick. I've been scribbling away, making notes as you've been talking. So yeah, so we thought we would now kind of open it up to everybody who's joined to ask some questions. But first of all, we just wanted to come back to you, Yola, because obviously at the very beginning, you gave us a bit of an overview as to how you found your kind of culture. You know, kind of 18 months ago, we were starting the journey with Leading Edge Performance, and we talked about the decompression and how that then showed this sense of niceness, not kindness. So yeah, I think we're all keen to know, how has that progressed since identifying that as a challenge? What is that now? What does that now look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, we've been on quite a huge journey. A lot of thanks to Ash, because he has been our super coach. I think the main thing that we spent time on as a lead team at the beginning that really helped us, which really resonates with what Nick and Ian have just been talking about, is about building trust. So we spent a lot of time looking at the trust equation and having some really deep conversations about feedback with each other, about where that trust equation sometimes falls down for us and where it could be even better. As a lead team now, we do speed back in all of our executive meetings, which is basically quick feedback. This is what's going really well. Even better if you could be doing X, Y, and Z. And it's just super natural and easy. It was quite clunky and awkward the first couple of times we did it, but now it's much easier. And we're trying to really role model how to give performance conversations in the moment. We obviously have a performance cycle, like I'm sure many organizations do. But to Ian's point, we're trying to do more. We're not just leaving it for the end of year process. We're trying to do, one-to-ones more regularly, mid-years, end of year, so that the feedback is alive and real, both positive and constructive feedback. And we've seen over a 50% increase in having to have more difficult performance conversations in our business, which has been incredible and has led sometimes to performance conversations, to performance improvement plans and exits from our business, but has also led to a lot of improvement in people growing in our business. So we've also increased our internal fill rate by something like 60% in our business in the last year, just by having some really good conversations with people. So, I mean, we've done tons of stuff. I could talk about it all day, what we've done, but it is a huge different business to what it was when we first started the work with Leading Edge. And a lot of it is thanks to the amazing team at Leading Edge Performance. So thank you very much, especially to Ash, because he's been there right from the beginning. So thank you.
Oh, you're making blush under the beard. Yeah, I think it's fascinating what you were saying there, Yola, because you said, obviously up front you were, kind of hemorrhaging talent, right? So you were seeing that people were having to, do more because others weren't necessarily holding their own. So the fact that you're now building that talent and seeing that internal talent come through is real. Yeah, it feels like that's testament to the work that you're doing, which is great. I just want to, there's a question just popped in the chat from Catherine. So Yola, how did you manage to keep the positive elements of your nice and friendly culture and not bounce too hard away from that? So how did you keep the tension?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that I really didn't want to move away from. I didn't want us to become a totally different organization. So that was something that really was important to me. I think it was just really focusing on what the key performance challenges were. We have this term in our business now, which is tough on the topic, not on the person. And I think if you keep that in your mind, you still keep that nice. It's still a lovely place to work, right? It still is. We still probably hit people a little bit too much sometimes with the carrot. We are a lovely place to be, but we now have really good performance conversations with people when we need to. And that's a great business to be in.
Yeah. Sounds like you've kind of got a really good balance there of the it is that kindness, that kind of trust that you are creating with people, and that gives you that ability to then have those conversations with them. That's great, thank you. So we brought Tom in as well. So if anyone wants to ask any questions of Tom around the feedback, then please do. So while you're thinking of your questions to our panelists, I have a couple here. So to Ian, so we thought about this topic a lot through the lens of holding performance conversations with athletes. So in your role as a program lead, how does it differ when it's a performance conversation with a peer or with a colleague as opposed to with an athlete?
Well, I guess that's what everybody on the call here is wrestling with day to day, right? It's one thing having an athlete in front of you, which is performance edged and there's an outcome in mind. There's another thing when it comes to, whether it's people you manage, whether it's colleagues, whether it's leaders, right? It's we sit here and say sport is perhaps easier and more fast moving, but the same challenges are the same. But honestly, to answer the question, I think the principles are the same, right? You still got to treat a colleague or a peer or a leader in the same way that you would treat an athlete. So, you need to, I think of one of my immediate colleagues where you got to know him well, you got to know the right time to have a conversation, whether you're either asking for something or you want to challenge on something. And if you get that timing wrong, as I said up front, know the time, know the place to have the conversations. You got to, let's say, know the person, you got to know what you're talking about. You're trying to minimize surprises. But I think the one key difference I would say is when you're with certainly peers or with other leadership colleagues, you've got to be more solution focused. So you've got to also hold some of the action points rather than going in to be delivering news and improve performance. You've actually got to say, this is what we're talking about, and this is how we need to see something evolve or improve. So I think that will be the biggest point of difference when I'm working across internals or kind of non-athletes, and certainly more leaders and peers, is right, but what we're going to do about it, rather than this is kind of the decision and this is why.
Thank you. Yeah, I like that. Let me pose one to you then, to Nick. So I guess, you know, athletes can be like hyper attuned to authenticity. So what is, do you think, the biggest mistake that leaders might make in things like their body language or their tone or their timing when they're trying to have a really high stakes performance conversation?
Yeah, I think Ian touched upon this a little bit earlier on. I think it's that kind of authentic, and that if you're incongruent with how that all lines up, I don't think it's just athletes and high performance, but they see through that a mile away, right? Like if you start pretending this is just a development conversation when everyone knows this is a performance issue, like, or I'm really open to your views, and then you hit them with a load of stuff and you're really defensive, like they see through that very, very quickly. So that kind of incongruence is the real challenge. And I think, you know, people don't listen to what leaders say as much as they listen to whether they believe them. So again, it's that kind of difference then, I think, a little bit between if you focus too much on the script, I think you're kind of missing the important bit, because people focus on the messenger, your pace, your tone, your energy, your body language. And often from my experiences, particularly high performers in sport, they'll kind of forgive awkward, clunky wording, right? But they rarely forgive a lack of authenticity. And it goes back to what both Ian and Yola have said, really, like if you know the person, that you can then deliver it in the way, but you've thought about how it's going to be delivered to them, with them in a two-way conversation, to then kind of lead into some of Tom's feedback. If you nail that incongruence bit, I think you've probably got much more of a chance.
Yeah, nice, thank you. Now I've just seen another question pop in from Susie. And this is, we can open this to any of you really. So to what extent might you also explore co-constructed solutions? So Ian, you just referenced there, you know, if you were talking or having a feedback conversation with a peer, you might look more at solutions. But how might you do that when you're talking to to an athlete or Yola in your instance to a team member or a peer?
Well, I'm happy to go. Well, exactly as you'd expect. If it's with an athlete, let's take the issue is around, you know, I don't know, I'll give probably a tennis example, so please bear with me. Somebody's first serve percentage is too low, right? That's the problem. So how are we going to build the solution to that? How are we going to use the various elements of our resource together, whether that's coaching, whether it's analysis, whether it's strength and conditioning, whether it's science and medicine, whatever it may be? How do we help you to address this problem? And I think in sport, that is a very common conversation linked to what is the performance problem? What solutions do we have at our disposal that can help you with that? And how do we action it? So I think it's a really simple and a very common thing in sport, that because it is around coaches trying to help athletes get better, and coaches don't hold all the discipline knowledge from all those different areas to help with the various different nuances.
How about you, Yola? How do you see that kind of apply from a kind of a business context?
I think it's just about, really framing what the challenges are that people are facing and co-constructing it together. And we're working on a model at the minute, the plan, do, check, act model, you know, where you kind of look at something and reframe it and then spend that time really focusing on the checking in aspect of it. And I think that could be quite a nice way to co-create something together.
Yeah, Lindsay, I think
I like that.
Like accountability is not the conversation. The conversation is like the starter bit to what happens afterwards. And that kind of like real simple framework that you can then co-create after, of like, what's the one behavior to change? What's our one measure of success? What's our follow-up date? And you co-create that with them, because ultimately you want them to own this. Because it's them and their development, their growth, or you're reinforcing the positive stuff that we talked about earlier on. But the conversation is just the starter to helping function the accountability afterwards.
Yeah, nice. I like that. Thank you. I've just got a couple of questions have popped in. So there's one here from Ollie. So in high performance sport, often athletes are really chomping at the bit for those performance conversations. They're eager for the feedback so that they can be their best. Do you think that that's the same in business? How could or how would that impact the leaders or the coach's role in actually giving that feedback and having that conversation? Who shall I come to first? Yola, I'm gonna come to you first.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in our business. People who are high performing talent want feedback all the time. They're like a dog with a bone, they won't leave it alone. Whereas people who are maybe, just happy in their roles, not wanting to progress, probably less so interested in having, clear feedback. So I think it is dependent on the person. I think it would be amazing if more people were asking for feedback, but sometimes I think it just comes down to fear. I think people are worried about what they're going to hear and how they're going to then deal with that, and maybe they don't want to hear it and they want to hide under the towel a bit. But yeah, if it's delivered in the right way, I think feedback, to Nick's point, can really unlock people's growth, and it makes such a huge difference. And that's definitely what we've seen in our business. So I think it's a brilliant thing to be doing.
Yeah.
Just has to be done in the right way.
But there is a parallel with that into sport. Sorry, Lindsay, where
go on.
There shouldn't be a misconception that all athletes want feedback. There's as many athletes that you have to try hundreds of different ways to try and get your point across. Right? Some people just locked into their beliefs, and they maybe don't want to hear a tactical play, or they don't want to understand what they're doing wrong because they're locked into their process, not what you have to say as the coach sitting on the side of the court. So I think it's the same in sport as in business. Sometimes you've just got to find the right solution for the right person, and that's where it all drums back to know the person, know how they're likely to react to feedback in a pressure moment, know how you need to build that in to get the best from that person, and accept everybody is different. Like I say, I think it was picture one where you had the tennis coaches on that first slide where the coaches were shouting at the player. I tell you can sit in reverse of that where the player is shouting at you as the coach, and that ain't a particularly comfortable place, because the last thing they want to hear from you is something that you said to them that, guess what, didn't work, and then you're the one on the receiving end of that. So I think it's just an important reality of sport isn't this kind of fluffy, everyone wants to get better. There is as many challenges in sport as there is in business.
That's really interesting. I like that. And I guess that kind of leads then on to, there's the importance of that kind of reverse feedback as well, that two-way. So, the athlete giving feedback to the coach, or the team member then giving feedback to the leader. How do you see that kind of play out? And is that, and Yola, in your experience, is that something that maybe you've started to see more of as you've been having more regular kind of feedback conversations?
Or people giving more feedback to the leadership team. Yeah, definitely, which has been brilliant. And we've also been on a bit of a journey with our safety culture, and people are really open to giving feedback on loads of different things, like, you should be holding the banister, stop looking at your phone, stop what you're doing, you need to, which is a small thing, but makes quite a big difference in the culture when people are willing to talk up and speak up about all sorts of bits of feedback. So, I think the more you give it, the more you get it, which is great. It's like recognition, sure. Isn't it? The more recognition you give, the more recognition you get back. So yeah, nice. I like that. Right, I've got a few more minutes. I'm just going to pick another a couple of questions. So a question here around the research, Tom, that you shared showed that athletes typically are more open to being receptive to feedback. Actually, we'll probably just cover this really. How do we support people to want to receive feedback and to play their part? So I guess there's a slight nuance to that, is how do we encourage people to want to take that feedback?
I think the thing that came out of the conversations that we had was all around setting that environment where feedback isn't seen as a real negative. And I think I want to pick up on something else that Yola said there a little bit. I think we also have a little bit of a misconception that the idea that just because somebody's not ambitious or doesn't want to climb the ladder doesn't mean they can't be coached and they can't improve. And I think we conflate the two things, and it doesn't necessarily, in the business world, I think we just almost sort of forget those people who feel that they're comfortable and feel that they're a bit of a lost cause. And I think there's definitely a point around actually building it into the muscle means that you don't need to be aiming to be the next leader, but you can still improve in what you're doing if you're having this feedback and it's built into the muscle of the organization. So I think being receptive to feedback is just there has got to be an element of taking the plunge, and that came out of I think it was 60% of the conversations that we had, in that you have got to get into it. But I think the other thing that we heard was about setting the rules of engagement to understand how that person is going to react to it best. And is it somebody who is going to, who actually likes quite direct, why on earth did you do that, versus, you know, another way of doing it, which might be a little bit more sort of coercive and curious. So I think it comes back to the point that Ian made earlier, in terms of understanding what makes that person tick, what is the thing that is going to bring the best out of them, and what is the kindest thing for them to know in that situation.
Nice, thank you very much. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all the questions there, but we'll see if we can maybe send them out to you, Ian, Yola, and Nick, and see if we can get some responses. But yeah, so thank you everybody for, thank you to our speakers for your time. So to Nick, Ian, Yola, thanks to Tom for putting together the research, and Ash for hosting the conversations today. Thanks everybody for attending. I did just want to kind of bring back up the summary that I very rudely cut off from Tom earlier, the summary of the research that we shared. So yeah, I think this really does kind of summarize the theme of the conversations that we've had today, around investing first in relationships. So I think, Ian, you know, you were talking earlier about, you know, authenticity being so important, because you can plan for conversations, but equally you'll need to have those you'll need to have some conversations very quickly, and you won't have the chance to plan. So if you have that investment in that human connection first, then that's really going to help you with those conversations. We've talked a lot about talking to the human, so it's very much about the context of that individual, of that human, and really leaning into who they are and how you think they are going to receive that feedback. And we talked about, yeah, showing up consistently. So the idea that, and we all know this, right, don't we? This shouldn't be about, you know, waiting for the quarterly performance conversations to be able to pounce on somebody and give them that, you know, that once a quarter feedback that you haven't, you know, been able to give during the quarter. So it's really, how do you give that feedback consistently? And then the reframe, I really liked Nick's reference, actually, reframing this idea of discomfort. So, you know, the discomfort of a 5-minute conversation versus the discomfort of ongoing frustrations and ongoing lack of performance. Really reframing in your mind the benefit of having that conversation, so that you can help that person to improve, and ultimately helping improve your team's performance and your organisation. So I think they were some really great themes there.